Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Today I am joined again by Rumination's Keith Preston and Swithun Dobson, and we're here to discuss the issue of the Blue Tribe, CHAZ, the left, and its reaction to the George Floyd shooting. So really, one way to look at all of this is everybody's been in lockdown for like 3 months, and a lot of this has led to pressure building up, especially since even before the coronavirus, Bernie Sanders and the sort of radical woke left were perceived themselves, probably correctly, to have been cheated out of the nomination. And so they've been festering for a while now. And I think the point of interest about George Floyd is not so much the incident itself, but what resulted from the incident. Where in June or beginning of June, the protesters tried to have another Occupy movement in Seattle. And there seems to be riots and all over the major cities, New York, Chicago, Atlanta, Seattle, talk about defunding the police, not to rehash all that again, which we discussed about 2 weeks ago. But so Keith, what are your thoughts on the sort of Blue Tribe and the tribes and the Blue Tribe's reaction to everything over the past month and a half?
Well, there's a lot of, all of that is complicated, and it's a lot more complicated than you're going to get from any analysis from the mainstream media, that's for sure. As for the tribes, as you know, the mainstream media, of course, tends to and just for the sake of convenience, they will talk about how there's there's the red states, and then there's the blue states. And then some years ago, there was a blogger by the name of Scott Alexander who started talking about these in terms of tribes. And there's a red tribe that has these certain characteristics, and they're more inclined to like NASCAR. And then there's the blue tribe that has these other characteristics, and they're more likely to go to art galleries or something like that. And based on all of these stereotypical indications of what these different tribes are, but to break it down on a simple level, the red tribe is the Republican-oriented right, the conservatives, whatever. The blue tribe is the Democratic-oriented left, the liberals, and all that. He also postulated the idea of a gray tribe, which is kind of like libertarians, only a kind of certain type of libertarians, I guess, but that's somewhat irrelevant, I think, to this discussion. But what's interesting, though, is that, at least in my analysis, I would see the blue tribe as largely a rising force in the wider U.S. society, and the red tribe, the more conservative sectors, as a declining force. To use a really rough analogy, I was thinking about this recently. In some ways, we could compare the current situation with what has happened in Iraq, and that may sound ridiculous on the surface, but if we look at Iraqi politics, what we see is they have their own version of the red tribe, which is the Sunni Arabs, who were the once dominant quote-unquote tribe. They're actually a collection of tribes, but then so was our red tribe. But so you had the Sunni Arabs, who under the Ba'athist regime were the dominant party, the dominant faction or whatever of the society. And now that has been dislodged, they've assumed more of a minority status, and it's the Shia who are now who are the majority and largely the ruling faction or collection of factions in Iraq. And then the third group are the Kurds, and they're a traditional outgroup that nobody likes, neither the Shia nor the Sunni. All right, and you have something that's very roughly analogous to that in the United States. You have the red tribe, which represents traditional WASP America, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant America. That was the dominant culture for most of the history of the United States, but which has largely become a minority in recent decades and is losing power over time. And then you have the blue tribe, which is a collection of groups that were once out groups or out of power or whatever, who are now ascendant and have grown in size to the point of becoming a slight majority. or close something, at least within the political realm, there's something of a majority. But then you also have a much larger group of people that is not, I don't really consider to be part of either the liberal or of the blue or red tribe. And that would be a number of different categories, really. The largest sector would be what I call the 46 percenters. And that is, you have the people who in the 2016 election, 46% of eligible voters did not vote. So clearly these are not people who identify strongly with either the red or the blue tribe. You also have a sector that a study some years ago identified as the majority, as the exhausted majority. Now these are people who may trend left or right, but they're not ideologues or heavily partisan either way, although they may be more inclined to vote than the 46 percenters. And then you have another group that's actually quite large, but it's smaller than the other two, but it's actually quite large. And that's just the underclass on a general level. And that is the predominantly urban, because there's more people in cities, but also urban and rural and even increasingly suburban sectors that are what the Marxists call the lumpen proletariat. And these are sectors that are outside of the respectable society on a general level. These are people who are chronically unemployed, often homeless, often make their living through illegal means, or they're dependent on the public sector assistance, or they are perhaps very low income working people, or perhaps they are sometimes employed in the conventional economy, but they also have a way of life that's somewhat marginal or something like that. There's a whole lot of these people. And to my mind, that was really the important sector in the recent uprising. From what I can tell about the recent uprising in the United States, it was largely this lumpen proletarian class, what the Marxists call the lumpen proletarians, that carried out much of the insurrection. I think that the media tended to deflect attention away from that towards two other things, towards either conventional protesters, that is your standard, protesters out there protesting for social justice or whatever, many of which are middle class people and stuff like that. I mean, you had Mitt Romney marching in one of these things, right? And then the media has also put all of their cards in the race basket as well. They're talking about race constantly. I'm seeing, on a daily basis, I see article after article in the mainstream media about something pertaining to race, usually something more ridiculous than the previous article. And just earlier today, I was looking at an article from the Houston, some media outlet in Houston, where they're saying that the local real estate brokers association are not going to, they're no longer going to call bedrooms master bedrooms, because, well, that implies a slave relationship or something. I mean, these are, I've had a lot of experience dealing with real estate brokers, and they go out of their way to make sure that poor, black people or whatever don't move into any of the areas that they don't want them in. But you have this virtue signaling going on, where they're going to change the name of their what they call a bedroom. And I've seen tons of this stuff in the media in recent days, which I think is completely cynical and completely ridiculous. And you see people on social media moving to get in on this. But I think all of this stuff really has the effect of, or I think it's intended to obscure what really happened, and that is you had a massive insurrection by what amounted to the lumpen proletarian class. And I think that that's something that is theoretically at least frightening to the power elite, and they don't want that to happen. They would prefer to make this about, racial justice, police brutality, social justice, some, nice progressive sounding thing, as opposed to what it actually was. So that's, I think, really where it stands. And I'd make a distinction. I guess the most important point I'd make beyond this would be, I'd make a distinction between the blue tribe and the actual insurrectionists. Like I watched Fox News and I watched Tucker Carlson and Sean Hannity and these guys, and they're talking about how the insurrectionists were the Democratic Party's militia, and they're out there, to bring communism to America. And probably most of the people who participated in the riots, in a serious way, wouldn't be able to tell you what communism is. Right? You ask them who Karl Marx was, they're like, what? I mean, I know a whole lot of people from those sectors, and that politics is not what motivates them. What motivated the people that were doing the looting and rioting was either economic need, economic want, or simply personal revenge against an institution or whatever that they think did something to them. They're not out there because they read too many books on critical race theory and that kind of stuff. Now that when you see the more conventional protests and some of the more leftist, specifically leftist oriented protests and college age people and stuff like that, yeah, I mean, that may be more of a left, blue tribe type of demographic, but I don't really think that's where the bulk of the rioting and looting and all that was coming from.
Yeah, the other element that I think is interesting and directly ties into some kerfuffle on the libertarian side is CHAZ. So, I mean, depending on who you hear, CHAZ seems to be one part, hippie, Woodstock, 4.0, whatever, where people are just getting high and playing music. But then there's also like, the tagging of buildings, the breaking of windows, the shooting now, increasingly more shootings. And recently, Jeff Dice and Walter Block got into an argument over is CHAZ libertarian or not. So yeah, Swithun, what are your libertarian thoughts on CHAZ? And is Hoppe really an anarcho-statist?
Okay, so CHAZ, it's very difficult to assess CHAZ because exactly what it is or what it is doing is not immediately obvious. So if it is just the case that it's, they're just playing music and it's a bit of a Woodstock, then it isn't really the autonomous zone that it claims that it is. Now, let's suppose, though, it is an autonomous zone and they are sort of doing a Rhodesia and doing a UDI in Seattle. Let's suppose they're doing that. Is that something libertarians should support? So just to recapitulate the arguments that Block and Dice made, Dice basically made the Hoppian argument that, well, they're effectively stealing public land from the taxpayer of Seattle because they're the ones who have paid for the road improvements, etc., via their taxes, and therefore it's theirs. Block says, well, it's stolen property. We don't know who to return it to. So as long as the state doesn't have it, that's an improvement. So in that basis, we should support CHAZ. That said, to note, Walter Block says that CHAZ is basically a bunch of Antifa sort of radicals, etc., and who are generally unpleasant, and so aren't really sort of the left Rothbardian that you could claim that they are. So his claim is, I think, more nuanced with Block is, if they were a bunch of sort of left Rothbardians doing this, then we should support them. If they are what they are, then we kind of don't. So Block just, as ever, just making a strict theoretical point, because that's seemingly his favorite thing to do. So whether they should be considered legitimate is an interesting question. So Dice's argument effectively comes from, now I don't remember exactly if Hoppe's arguments about taxpayers owning government property comes before his articles on immigration or after. I don't remember the chronology, because he does have an article on desocialization, which I think predates his immigration work. I'm not sure. But the primary motivation for the government ownership of property, the taxpayer owning of government property in reality really motivates his immigration stance more than anything else. But at least that's the way it typically is used. And I would really see Hoppe's argument with respect to that as in a sense, more of a pragmatic argument. It's like, well, let's suppose we're going to have the state in this geographical area. How should they operate? And then he invokes the taxpayer funding. Because really, you could argue that CHAZ is just a secessionist group. And I was thinking about this. Well, any secessionist group is going to have the problem that, they could claim that, I think is it Mississippi that receives the most federal funding of any US state from memory? I don't remember. But let's suppose that there's going to be some net tax receivers, let's say, in Mississippi. If Mississippi decides to go UDI and claims itself that they're a state, a sovereign entity, have they stolen property from taxpayers in New York City? Maybe, I suppose. But I think you've got to really treat this on a more pragmatic basis to a large extent. I mean, whether you could compensate them in retrospect, yeah, maybe, if you could have some sort of agreement with them. But, I mean, if they were a genuine sort of autonomous zone, I think on the basis of decentralization, even if it wasn't perfect, you should support it from libertarian grounds. On Hopper, is he an anarcho-statist? Well, you could make the claim that Hopper basically says that any owner of land is a sovereign, and so effectively can do whatever he so wishes with anybody on his property, in which case you could call him an anarcho-statist, I suppose. Now, interesting, you probably couldn't call Block an anarcho-statist, because Block says, because Block says, if someone just walks on your land by accident, you can't shoot them. Now, to be fair, I think Hopper thinks probably in practice the same, but the way in which his arguments tend to gravitate, you could make that claim. But Hopper's actually more pragmatic than you give him credit for, because he claims that he says his parents had property expropriated by East Germany, and they were then given compensation eventually by the unified government, but it was such a derisory sum that it was basically wasn't worth anything. But he said, look, it's so long ago, it's so difficult to work out, whose property it was, who it was taken to, and who to take the money from. You basically just have to go, well, we'll just have to get on with it. And he makes a similar case with respect to Israel. So despite his theory, in a sense, he is a lot more pragmatic than his extreme a priorism may lead you to believe. So in short, if CHAZ is a genuine autonomous zone, Block is right in my view.
All right, Ruminations, what are some of your thoughts on this?
I think that what is most interesting to me is the larger context in which this is being allowed to take place. I remember hearing Noam Chomsky just summarily dismiss a comment out of hand because someone was complaining about identity politics on the left. And he said that nobody on the right has the right to complain about identity politics because it's actually, let's call it Caucasian nationalism, is really the most well-organized, well-funded kind of identity politics in existence. And if I could speak to Noam Chomsky, I think the one question that I would ask him is, what do you think would happen if Richard Spencer, at the height of his infamy, had managed to set up a society analogous to CHAZ, but in favor of white identity politics? Do you think it would have lasted for more than 24 hours before they had sent SWAT teams in and the entire thing had been deconstructed? I think that is one thing that's telling, is that the very existence of such a society shows exactly who is allowed to operate and exactly who is not allowed to operate. Now, I am not doing what Keith has cautioned us against and confusing these people with the establishment, but to risk a cliched analogy, I think that these people are, to the left-wing blue state establishment, what the Freikorps were to the National Socialists. And I don't mean that quantitatively. I mean that qualitatively. I think that there's a similar dynamic at play, because if you look at what's happened ever since Donald Trump became elected, first, they contested the legitimacy of the election itself. Immediately after that, you had Russiagate. No sooner had the ink dried off of Russia, of the final paper conclusion that had been delivered with respect to the Mueller findings, that suddenly Trump was now under investigation for investigating Joe Biden for doing the same thing that he was investigating Joe Biden for doing, and this led to the impeachment process. No sooner had the impeachment process been over than suddenly the entire nation needed to be locked down because of COVID. No sooner did the curve start to flatten regarding COVID then suddenly that didn't matter anymore, and suddenly there needs to be a people of color revolution to deal with police brutality because one person happened to have a heart attack on the wrong day. I think that this is simply the latest installment in the effort of the political establishment to make sure that Joe Biden never has to share a debate stage with Donald Trump. That anything that will come out of his mouth will be overshadowed by the spectacle of the Trump presidency as the chaos presidency. I think that it looks very much like right before the National Socialists were elected in Germany, that they just created as much relentless chaos as possible with the kind of underlying threat promise, if you elect us, we will stop. This will end if you do what we want. It's very difficult to not see this as an attempt to essentially confuse, threaten, bully the population into saying, well, whatever you think about Donald Trump, whether it's his fault or not, Donald Trump is chaos. Donald Trump's very presence in office means chaos. You do what we say, and we will withdraw these forces. Now, whether or not that means that the Democratic establishment will proceed with their own analog to the Night of Long Knives or not is another question. Maybe that would be an unlooked for benefit of the ascendancy of a Democratic presidency in the future. But I find it very difficult to imagine this working for them, precisely because as mentally deficient as so many people are, I think that the average American is probably better than the average person through history at being able to discern when they're being bullied or not. And I think that this really, all of it, the existence of CHAZ, the riots, everything, is essentially the fact that the Democrats no longer want to get elected through lying. So their strategy has simply become to bully the opposition into capitulating to them and essentially saying, well, if you won't give us this election, then we will take it from you. I hate to sound overtly partisan in this, and my purpose is not to sound partisan in favor of the Republicans. It's rather to say that even from the most neutral standpoint that I can manage, it's very difficult to not see this as a kind of very desperate political move in order to kind of grease their way into office. So I see this as largely a function of the evolution of electoral politics in the United States.
Yeah, there's a lot of ways to go with this, but I think with all the stuff that's been said, one thing jumps to mind immediately. Before Alex Jones got nuked off the internet a few years ago, he said that because of online media, more people were waking up to the controlling mechanism of the elite than ever before. Now, obviously, Alex Jones and Project Veritas, which don't easily fit into the alt-right or libertarian camp that well, played a part. But also you had the alt-right, you had the manosphere, you had this period from 2012 to 2018 where the internet became a superhighway for all sorts of heretical and beliefs that the establishment didn't like. And you can see by their heavy-handed repression after Charlottesville that the elite is in some sense very scared because they waited way too long to shut down these people. By the time they started purging alt-right and manosphere content and Alex Jones content, it had already been out there for at least a decade. It was too late. I mean, they'd already sort of permeated this large area. The other thing I heard from both sides, right and left, about 2 years ago, beginning around there, is that the time for debate is over, the time for mobilization has begun. And you hear a lot of people say, well, why can't the right mobilize? Well, I mean, in part, the right's taking a longer time to mobilize because it's fundamentally decentralized, which in the short term can be perceived as a weakness because it means they don't get boots on the ground fast enough. But in the long run, it's a strength because it makes it very difficult for the establishment to eliminate them. And a lot of these lumpen proletariat types that Keith is talking about, I tend to agree with Right Ruminations that they are working as these sort of unofficial paramilitary-esque elements. And they were able to mobilize relatively quickly because the left with Antifa and going back to the anti-globalist protests in the 90s have this already established mechanism of rapidly mobilizing large amounts of people to get them out to just cause mayhem. The right doesn't really have a comparable system to throw up like that. So in that regard, but we are seeing the mobilization. In fact, I think Keith Preston on your website, you've posted a couple examples of Catholics defending statues of their saints. There was the Columbus statue in Philly that was protected by Italian Americans. There are people that are beginning to, in Arizona, there was a guy that was trying to protect that conquistador statue, ended up shooting a few assailants. So it is beginning to happen. It's just not happening as rapidly as the left. And, with their more extreme rhetoric, more extreme demands, I think it's indicative of the fact that they kind of know that this is their high watermark. If they don't capitalize on all of this influence and power they have now, it'll be too late. It's sort of like that Lenin moment, Lenin in February of 1917, it's now October rather of 1917. It's now or never. If we don't strike now, there's no revolution. And I think that's, if you want to use an analogy to the Russian Revolution, that's the kind of stage I think these people on the left think that they're in. They're in this October moment where if they don't move now, they won't be able to move again. Because one of the things we constantly hear is the polls favor Biden, which, if you believe the polls after 2016, I don't know what to tell you. The polls said Hillary was going to win by a landslide. And leading up to COVID, there were all these people leaving the Democratic Party, either becoming centrist or outright voting for Trump. So one way I think that they're seeing this is that Trump will win, and that Trump will have a popular mandate to crush the dissent and break up these tech companies with. I'm saying that's what I think they think Trump is going to do. And they know that if it gets that far, it's too late. They have to make sure that never happens. And I think that's why they're going balls to the wall, as it were. What are your thoughts, Keith?
Well, as far as the way that the center left and left opinion is reacting at the present time, what I think is interesting is that it seems like there's a de facto axis that's been formed that ranges from the far left all the way over to some of the unreconstructed Bush Republicans and neocons. We're talking about everything from the Mitt Romney and John Bolton and Bill Kristol on the neocon and Bush Republican end of things, all the way over to the far left, that seems to collectively think that, well, no matter what, Donald Trump has got to be removed from office. Now, they may have totally different reasons why they believe that, but that does seem to be a huge consensus that's developing among the political class on a general level, and certainly most of the media is on their side. I think that's one thing that's happening. In fact, one thing that I saw recently is an interview with Noam Chomsky, where, now this is, keep in mind, Noam Chomsky is one of the most famous intellectuals in the world, and certainly the left's leading intellectual. And he came out recently and said Donald Trump is the greatest criminal in history. Meaning that Hitler and Stalin and Mao Zedong and Pol Pot and Ramses and Genghis Khan and all of these other folks were apparently just rookie leaguers and paving the way for the real thing, which is Donald Trump. Now, I would say that's a totally irrational and downright stupid thing for someone of Chomsky's level of education to say. But, it is what it is. To me, Trump is basically just a standard New York liberal. He could be a Giuliani Republican or an Ed Koch Democrat. But what that says to me, though, is that the lesson I take from that is that this substantial sectors of liberal and left opinion simply view Trump and presumably Trump supporters as an existential enemy. They're not people who are simply wrong or bad or disagreeable or anything like that. I mean, they're a mortal threat to all good things. I mean, they're the Nazi Party and the Mussolini Fascisti and Francisco Franco all rolled into one. And that seems to be the way the left is acting. But once again, I think I would have to separate the left from much of the rioting and looting and stuff that's happened in more recent times. I don't get any indication that was spurred by leftist agitation or anything like that. I think the protests, I think the BLM protests and stuff like that. And one thing too that I've noticed is that as the looting and more serious violence has decreased, there's been an increase in the violence against, or vandalism at least, of the statues. And I tend to think that all of that is coming from two different places. I tend to think that the statue vandalism thing is the left. It's a lot of these Antifa people and anarchists and far left people and maybe some Black Lives Matter people and plus some others that are just joining in because there's no sports going on or anything like that. But I think, though, that from everything that I saw of the looters, the rioters, the people who burned down police station, the people who looted Target and all these kinds of places, they seem to me, and I saw this in my local area as well as nationwide, they seem to me to come from a much different demographic than the standard radical left activist crowd, either in its more center left Democratic Party form or the further left social justice warrior and Antifa form. For instance, in my area, a lot of the people doing looting and stuff like that were white, and they tended to be older people in their, relatively in their late 20s and 30s, and they came from a class sector that the Antifa type and stuff like that are not typically drawn from. So in other words, what I'm saying is that I think a lot of the more hardcore stuff that we saw going on during the uprising was actually, what in conventional terms is called the criminal class, engaged in an actual insurrection, and they doing it for entirely egoistic reasons. Max Stirner would be proud. They were out stealing because they wanted stuff. They were shooting cops and burning down police stations out of personal revenge, not because they are standing with the dialectic of history or anything like that. So I don't know that the powers that be, either blue tribe or red tribe, want that kind of stuff to happen. I think, though, that what has happened is that certainly substantial sectors of the corporate class, obviously all of the media, and many other sectors have tried to bend this in their direction. You've seen all these corporations now, some of whom actually use child slave labor in Africa and Central America and the Philippines, putting out statements about how racism is morally unacceptable and stuff like this. I gave the example a short time ago with the realtors. They're not gonna have master bedrooms anymore. So I see all of this as just a very cynical effort to bend the uprising towards something that they can use as a marketing gimmick, essentially. I think that a lot of the corporate class is doing that. You've got what I call it's not my term, but it's Joel Kotkin's term, the new clerisy, that is these PC ideologues that dominate a lot of the ideas industries like education and media and journalism and all of that. They're the ones who really believe in this stuff. Certainly they're trying to bend it in their direction. I think a lot of the, opinion leaders are trying to fuel race hysteria. I don't think they really want to have a full-blown insurrection against the state or whatever. I think that they would much prefer that this be a race war rather than a class war or war against the state. So I tend to think that there's a sharp distinction that needs to be made there. And of course, the Democrats are obviously trying to bend it in their direction electorally. And I tend to agree that while polls do show that Biden keeps surging ahead of Trump. We can't really believe anything the polls say based on past experience. Another thing that came out recently that I think is interesting is now the New York Times is trying to claim that American intelligence discovered that the Russians were trying to put bounties on American troops, that they were trying to pay Afghan militants bounties to kill American troops, which I suppose the only reason I could think the Russians might want to do that would be to try to give the Americans incentive to leave so they can come to dominate Afghanistan once more like they did before. But it seems much more likely that this is just simply a made-up story that's trying to once again bring the whole Trump as a Russian puppet line into the forefront. It seems like that they just can't seem to drop that, the whole Trump as a Russian puppet thing. This kind of left John Bircherism that we've seen emerge in the past few years. So it's like all this stuff is kind of going on at the same time, but in some ways, though, it's not really related in many ways. I think that different things that have happened have come from different sectors. I mean, for example, the coronavirus, I think that's obviously a real issue, but it's obvious that it's the left tried to exploit it for its own ends. Largely to get some anti-Trump mileage out of it, and then to lambaste the protesters against the lockdown, saying, "Oh, look at these, science rejecting rubes," and that kind of stuff. And then 2 weeks later, it's suddenly fine to go out and do mass protests and lock arms in the street, thousands of people, and that kind of stuff. So it's interesting times we're in.
Swithun, what are your thoughts?
I think I'm just going to give a state of what's happening here in England. There obviously isn't the anti-Trumpism in England because Trump obviously isn't there, and there is nowhere near to the same extent a large sort of cultural war between anti and pro BLM types. Even like the Prime Minister Boris Johnson was basically like, "Oh yeah, BLM got legitimate concerns, etc." Though he did say he didn't like them attacking statues or whatever. But the events in America which came over to here have really just accelerated the sort of cultural left, which isn't necessarily which largely isn't the economic left, at least not for the numbers' sake, to really exercise complete domination over all institutions. Possibly the best example of this, there's the Northumbria police. We're going to go out and join, this is the police, we're joining a BLM vigil, and they invoked a law, Section 14 of the Public Order Act, to prevent any counter-protests. The police have completely got on the LGBT XXXYZZ, whatever you want to add onto there. BLM, it has all been completely absorbed into everything, into all the major institutions. And this is just really, I think, going to be a push to anathematize even sort of like really soft conservative thought from the 1990s. You've got now even the Archbishop of Canterbury, who is now considering removing churches not removing churches. It's not quite that bad. Removing statues from churches because they might offend people, because they might have links to historical slavery or whatever. And I mean, the Church of England kind of used to be a church, and then it became a good art curator, but now it's not even that. On art, there was I don't know if you came across this tweet. There was a woman who is the head of like an arts museum, or she was an expert on it, and she gave advice on Twitter as to how to permanently damage statues. Because most of the damage you can get off because they don't really know what they're doing. But she was giving proper information as this is the best way to get rid of them. And these people are just completely and utterly dominant, and they have completely taken control. Now, they are not economic leftists to any large degree. They're just corporate capitalists types. They're not going to advocate in the public ownership of the means of production. They might advocate nationalization of the railways, but that'd be about it. And I don't know what the sports like in America, but the footballers in the really oddly reconstructed Premier League have now got Black Lives Matter on the backs of their shirts instead of their names, and they all take the knee before the game. And there was a match up in Burnley in North England where a guy paid for one of these flyby banners from a plane, and at this point flew a banner "White Lives Matter." At which point everybody went insane about how racist this was, because it was deviating from Black Lives Matter. And interestingly, prior to this, there had been a few days previous, there was a stabbing and killing of 3 men in Reading by 2 white guys who interestingly were homosexual. This by a brown guy. I can't remember if he was an asylum seeker or whatever, but he was clearly somewhat melanin enriched. This just was just unconscionable for the media. They were just, and then the Burnley Football Club were kind of prostrating themselves, saying, "Oh, these people doing this should have be banned from attending ever again." And worse, the guy who was behind it, he didn't apologize, which was good, but then he was sacked by his employer for breaking some nebulous social media rules that they've sort of created. Worse than that, his girlfriend worked at a beauty salon, and they sacked her as well, even though she had nothing directly to do with it. It's like, "Oh no, we found that she's kind of unpleasant views. Oh, we better get rid of her somehow." I'm sure that must be in breach of contract. And the thing is, she was obviously like not unpleasant, because we were like, "Oh, I couldn't possibly think that she would hold these sorts of views." It's like, well, yeah, because these kind of people might be reasonable and like relatively decent people that you could just get on with and go, "Oh, okay, didn't think you'd think that." But you've got the situation where you're going after, in England, relatives of people who don't think that Black Lives Matter happens to be the most kosher of organizations. So in England, I think it's just an attempt at really ratcheting up the sort of trying to erase sort of the traditional narrative of sort of English history. You could call it the English narrative history, and replace it with a very progressive view that's actually, well, we haven't even reached year 0 yet. Everything was just horrible and terrible. And how we need to show how much Black people have contributed to British society, and how all the inventions they made in like the 15th century and 16th century, just to sort of they enrich society. I mean, it's just going to go like this. I mean, he was generally wasn't taken very well when Corbyn suggested talking about the evils of the British Empire as being mandatory on the curriculum. But that's kind of going that way. And Channel 4 did an experiment whereby they kind of segregated Black and white students in schools and tried to teach all the white ones about how evil they were from their backgrounds. And so they were fighting racism by bringing back segregation. So yeah, it's completely and utterly insane, and there isn't really any countercultural people with any particular weight here. So yeah, we just go further into the mire.
Okay, right, Ruminations, what are your thoughts?
I heartily agree that the best job for the Church of England is as art curators, and they should probably stick to that particular occupation. With respect to the link between the establishment left and these activists, I am of a divided mind, because one thing that it does remind me of is in the 19th century in Prussia, you had this phenomenon of socialists of the chair, where you had the dirty Marxist socialist on the street, and then you had these people in the Prussian state who adopted certain welfare state socialist policies in order to buy them off and to kind of create the respectable bourgeois center-left version of that. Now, here, as Swithun pointed out, we're not dealing with literal communist Marxists, but we're dealing with what are called cultural Marxists. So I wonder if these corporate elites are kind of an analogous cultural Marxist of the chair, as it were, that are meant to, in some way, buy off this revolutionary momentum and incorporate it into something that's pro-establishment. But on the other hand, I also wonder if sometimes they are trying to intensify the radicalization of society in order to further shore up opportunities for more regulations, for greater litigious power of litigation, of eliminating competition by squeezing out smaller enterprises and things of that nature. So it seems to be this sort of paradoxical situation where they are creating something to destabilize society, but then they are also trying to buy off the thing that they're creating. So that on the one hand, it looks like they are analogous to the Lenin's useful idiots. But on the other hand, it looks like they're also analogous to the socialists of the chair. That is, they're creating something while simultaneously trying to buy it off. And I'm not even entirely certain that they understand what it is that they're doing, that I think it is in some ways, much more organic than one might think. I would also reiterate that third example of the National Socialists, right? The idea you side with revolutionaries, you try to get them to create enough instability that you can then come in as the stabilizer. So it's almost like there are three strategies going on simultaneously. On the one hand, they're selling out to the left. On the other hand, they're trying to buy the left out. And on the third hand, they're encouraging them as a catalyst for their own power. So there really is this kind of convergence of just about every business pipeline to socialist analogy throughout history you could think of. They're all converging here. There's some reiteration of all these patterns going on in this particular instance. And this has to make me think that while it's partly intentional, I think it might also be partly just an unwitting sociological pattern that tends to emerge whenever a class sees an opportunity for power, but they also see that as a threat, and they also have all of these other motivations. I really do think that there is a confused and paradoxical sense in which the moderate left relates to the far left, because they're trying to use them, create them, and buy them off simultaneously.
Yeah. Well, nearing the end of the hour, I think we're opening up onto final statements, and I'll begin with mine. I think one of the key issues with this coalition is precisely that it is so unstable. So, for example, the Wisconsin senator that was attacked recently himself was homosexual, and yet he was attacked and beaten within an inch of his life by the mob that ostensibly people like him had helped create. So clearly they're not making any distinctions between the woke coalition about who they're going to target. And I think much like Tolkien's orcs, the problem with these people is they viscerally hate each other almost as much as they viscerally hate the right. And so they often turn on each other, as we see. I mean, you've mentioned this before, Keith. Whenever there's these movements, it always ends in a fist fight between like the anarchists and the LGBTQ and the blacks and the Hispanics. And so, again, I think that the main issue is it's an unstable coalition. They fundamentally hate each other almost as much as they hate the right. And I think they feel like this is their last chance before the coalition just tears itself apart. So, Keith, what are your final statements?
Yeah, there's certainly a lot of fragmentation on the left. Right now, for example, you have a huge fragmentation between the centrist neoliberals like the Nancy Pelosi types, and then the political sectors of the political class that are further left, the Bernie Sanders and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez types and all of that. And then you have people that are much further to the left of them who consider them to be sellouts and all of that as well. And you do have not only the ideological fragmentation and strategic fragmentation, but you have all the different identity group fragmentation and so forth. I think, for example, that we're starting to see more conflicts between males and females on the left, between the different minority ethnic groups, between the minority ethnic groups and the gays. I've seen fist fights break out between vegans and vegetarians and different anarchist factions and things like that as well. I've also noticed that the tanky type Marxist-Leninists, the actual communists, are starting to have their own little subculture. They're starting to make something of a comeback, kind of like the National Bolsheviks, or their parallel on the far right, I guess. But I tend to think a lot of that kind of stuff is more of a side issue. I think that one thing that gets lost in a lot of this is a discussion of social class. And I interpret what happened in the United States in recent months as basically this. You had a lot of people who had been under de facto house arrest for several months, including a whole lot of restless young people for whom there's no school, there's no college classes, and there's no sports, there's no movies, there's no concerts, there's no nightclubs, there's no parties, there's no bars, nothing like that. And then parallel to that, you had the economic depression where a lot of people are put out of work and they can't pay their bills and stuff like that. And I think that those two things combined were much more of a catalyst for the uprising than what happened to George Floyd. I think that perhaps the George Floyd incident was a trigger, and perhaps that ignited some uprisings or rebellions in one particular place. But while it's certainly true that there have been a lot of mass protests over Black Lives Matter and over George Floyd, and just as there have before this, I mean, there have been issues like this in a number of American cities for a number of years now, in Ferguson and Baltimore and places like that. But I think that while that element of the uprising was there, the protest against perceived police brutality against blacks, I think that was certainly there. And then this kind of more middle class oriented, social justice protests, I think, were there. But once again, I have to keep coming back to the idea that I don't think that that's where a substantial sector of the more extreme behavior actually came from. I think a lot of the more extreme stuff was more what happened in Los Angeles in 1992. From everything that I have read about what happened in Los Angeles in 1992, the Rodney King riots, that came from a much different demographic than anything that's normally associated with the political left. The riots in 1992 came from deep in the inner city areas. While certainly race was a component of that, it wasn't because these folks were reading books on critical race theory and stuff like that. It was more just, I would say it was akin to the old-fashioned peasant revolts that used to happen in the Middle Ages. It was the lower classes, taking out their frustrations on the system. And I saw a lot of that going on in this particular uprising lately, that I think in a way that I think was distinct from the political left. It was distinct from this kind of middle class, do-gooder liberalism. It was distinct from a lot of the social justice-y and anti-far and far left type of stuff. I think that the people, for example, who burned down the police station in Minneapolis were not from any of those sectors. I think they were probably more from the more lower class, predominantly, though not exclusively, minority sectors, many of whom are not politically conscious. I was actually making an argument about this with someone recently. When you look at a lot of these kinds of lumpen sectors that have been involved in the uprising, I mean the ones that were actually looting Target and stuff like that, I know a whole lot of people from those demographics and from those socioeconomic levels. These are not politically conscious people. These are people that, even if they're black, they don't know what decade Martin Luther King did his work in. They don't know why he was named Martin Luther. They don't know what year he died. If you ask them what was something he said, well, I have a dream thing, right? And that's the limit. Like the statue vandalism is a good example. Most of these lumpen lower income sectors, they have no idea what any of these statues are about. They might know what the Confederate flag thing is. Oh yeah, white rednecks like that or whatever. But I know a whole lot of people from these sectors of all colors, of all ethnic backgrounds, who don't know what the 4th of July is. They think it's just a day to set off fireworks. They have no idea what the political aspect of that is. Who don't know what country America separated from. I had one time that said, was it Germany? I think it was Germany. Who know that there was the Second World War and that a guy named Hitler existed. They don't know what century that occurred in. They know that there was a U.S. Civil War. They don't know what century that happened in. They know that maybe there was some kind of revolutionary thing in 1776. They don't know who wrote the Declaration of Independence. So these are not people with that kind of mindset are not people that are going to be going out motivated to go out and tear down a statue of Thomas Jefferson because he was a slaveholder. They don't even know who he was. I think that all of these sectors need to be separated from each other, and I think that's one of the main things that's getting lost in a lot of the analysis I've seen of this situation.
Okay, Swithun, final thoughts.
I do think the left is fragmenting to some extent, although I don't think it will particularly matter, at least not in the medium term, the short or medium term. The media class and the left, the media class have still got the great bogeyman of the far right man who probably is just a 17-year-old who shit posts on the internet somewhere. They'll have a big bogeyman of him and they'll just wheel them out every time, and this will unite the left, because the left is, I primarily view the left, social or economic, as negative in nature. They're always against, in the sense they're reactionary in a certain sense. They are just against what currently exists. And so as long as the media can create an evil bogeyman to be against, they will unite sufficiently to prevent that from continuing. So I see a continuation of the dominance, at least in the cultural realm, in all the major institutions, particularly in education, the arts, etc. So just on the far right thing, it's all the BLM people went out in England, and then a week later, some like football type hooligan-y types turned up just to protect the statues, and then the police turn up in riot gear when previously they just sort of joined in. And then the media goes, far right guys. It's just like, they're just kind of guys who go to football and drink lager. And like, yeah, we don't like people attacking statues. We don't know why particularly, but it feels wrong. And then somehow they're the evil underbelly of English society. And you'll just get more of that. Even the left splintering will eventually hurt them, but I don't see that happening yet. I think there's too many people with too much of an influence to who can use them in a strategic fashion to avoid that being a problem. Yeah, that's all I'd have to say on that.
Okay, Rumination, final thoughts. Well, yeah. we better give them about a minute to get back, but yeah, I guess the one thing I'll say while we're waiting is the idea that because a lot of these people are implicitly acting in the interest of corporations. Oh, he's back. Never mind. Okay, Ruminations, final thoughts.
Final thoughts, just to build on what Swithun was said, the boogeyman of the far left, or of the far right, that the media speaks of now is not only a 17-year-old shit poster, but it's now a 17-year-old shit poster who is probably a communist or something. But I would say that final takeaway would be that the chaos that we're seeing right now manifesting in CHAZ and all of these other activities is something that can be interpreted either in a very pessimistic way or a very optimistic way. I think that the optimistic way of looking at it is that this is the left, as it has become accustomed to being in power, going down in flames, that they are going down swinging, that this is a kind of final tantrum. The more pessimistic interpretation is that this is a sign that their power hold is accelerating, that they're furthering their grip on society. I think it probably could be a mixture of both, because I think that it is true that this is indicative of a more politically radicalized society going forward, in which the left is more radical than it has been traditionally in the US. However, I also think that it is them throwing a tantrum at the fact that in reaction to that, the right will also in the future come to look more like a legitimate right. So I think that it's both the left losing power in some senses and in other ways gaining power as politics in general becomes more radicalized. That would be my concluding remarks.
All right. Thanks again, Swithun Dobson, Keith Preston, and Ruminations. This is Todd Lewis signing off.